A cop mocks an elderly black woman in court, then is shocked to know she's a high-ranking FBI director. They say respect is earned, not demanded. But inside a bustling courthouse in central Atlanta, a young cop named Officer Peter Harris was determined to ridicule anyone he deemed beneath him, especially a gentle, elderly black woman quietly sitting at the defendant's bench. Little did he know that she carried decades of power behind her unassuming eyes. As Peter hurled mean jokes at her expense, she remained composed. The courtroom stirred with an uneasy tension, yet no one, least of all Peter, expected that in mere moments he'd discover the woman wasn't just any defendant. She was Director Beatrice L. Hathaway, a high-ranking FBI official. On a humid summer morning in Atlanta, Georgia, the city streets seemed to thrum with anticipation. Temperatures soared early, the haze of heat curling above the concrete. Drivers jockeyed for position along Peachtree Street, horns blaring as throngs of people hustled to their jobs. Beneath that everyday chaos, a subtle tension pulsed, a lingering sense that something monumental was simmering beneath the surface. It was an intangible feeling, a quiet flutter in the chest that typically precedes important historical moments. Among the many vehicles inching along was a standard blue-and-white police cruiser driven by Officer Peter Harris, 29 years old, brimming with pride, and often brash. He was precisely the sort of officer who enjoyed the aura of authority that came with his uniform. A muscular, clean-shaven man, Peter held the steering wheel as though it were a trophy. His radio crackled with dispatches about minor disturbances. He dismissed them with a quick, uninterested flick of his eyes. Peter's partner, Officer Robert Green, older and far more measured, sat quietly in the passenger seat. Robert was used to Peter's overconfidence, but sometimes it still got under his skin. They had been assigned to manage traffic flow near the courthouse, where a few high-profile cases were happening that day. The morning's docket included everything from petty theft to corporate fraud, nothing that typically warranted a high-security presence. Yet rumors floated that a few quiet but influential federal figures would be appearing to observe. At a red light, Peter's gaze drifted to the sidewalk. He spotted an elderly black woman in a modest, floral print dress, carrying a small leather handbag. Her posture was straight, chin lifted with quiet determination. She appeared ordinary, if a bit regal in her careful steps. Without knowing precisely why, Peter sneered. Maybe it was the sight of someone crossing the street too slowly for his liking, or maybe an unconscious bias that occasionally found its way to the surface. Look at that old lady. Bet you she's going to cause traffic just because she's taking her sweet time, Peter grumbled, more to himself than to Robert. Robert simply shot him a disapproving glance, but said nothing. The light turned green, and the cruiser rolled forward, weaving through the busy intersection. They had no idea that in less than an hour, that same elderly woman would be in the same courtroom as them, though for entirely different reasons. Nor did Peter realize that the moment they crossed paths would set off a chain of events that would rock his entire life. Officer Peter Harris hadn't always been so callous. Raised in a strict household just outside of Atlanta, he grew up with moderate means, often hearing stories of how his grandparents had struggled to find their place in a racially divided South. Ironically, those stories hadn't taught him empathy. They had taught him to be tough, suspicious, and to scoff at the idea of kindness being repaid. Over the years, he found that belittling others offered him a twisted sense of superiority. Even in the police academy, while his peers were taught the foundational motto, to serve and protect, Peter fixated on the power aspect, the uniform that would turn heads, the authority that could demand compliance. His partner, Robert, had tried to temper Peter's more toxic tendencies. When Peter ridiculed suspects in the interrogation room, Robert often stepped in gently, reminding him about departmental protocol and basic respect. But Peter dismissed it, seeing it as weakness. He believed fear was the fastest route to compliance. On that scorching morning, Peter's cynicism was at an all-time high. A particularly harsh internal affairs review board had recently slapped him with a formal reprimand for unprofessional conduct. He felt singled out and persecuted, even though any objective observer would note he had earned that reprimand. Peter's ego refused to allow him to see his own faults. As they neared the courthouse, dispatch alerted them to a minor altercation. A woman had run a red light and nearly clipped another vehicle. The near accident happened right in front of the Fulton County Courthouse. Officers were requested to mediate. Robert turned off the radio and nodded in the direction of the building. "We'll handle it," he said. Peter smirked. "Let's go see who dares to violate the law right on our watch." They arrived to find a young man in an old pickup truck and that same elderly black woman from earlier, now behind the wheel of a sleek black sedan. She was parked crookedly near the curb, the front bumper a few inches from the truck's door. Peter's eyes narrowed as he approached. Though the woman showed no outward signs of panic, she looked mildly annoyed and concerned. Her well-pressed floral dress seemed out of place for a standard traffic infraction, almost as though she was heading to something important and was now delayed. Peter approached with heavy steps, glancing over at the minor scratch on the truck. "Well, look who decided to run a red light," he said, a note of mockery in his tone. "You in a hurry, Grandma?" Robert made a face at the remark, but stayed silent as he started taking notes. "I'm sorry, officer," the woman replied. "I truly didn't see that it was red. I thought I had enough time to go through." Her voice was firm but polite. "A likely story," Peter muttered, pulling out his ticket pad. "Is that your excuse every time you break the law?" The woman paused, her dignified composure unwavering. "No, officer, it's just a genuine mistake." Peter scoffed. He spent a few moments writing the citation, then tore it from his pad. "Your license, please," he demanded. She handed over her driver's license. The name read, Beatrice L. Hathaway. Peter barely glanced at it. The name meant nothing to him in that moment. After running it through the system on the cruiser's computer, he found no priors, no outstanding warrants. Her driving record was immaculate, which only served to irritate him more. Perhaps he had wanted something to pin on her. "I should cite you for reckless driving," he said, returning to her door. "But consider yourself lucky. I'm just giving you a ticket. Pay the fine, watch the road, and don't run red lights in the future." "Yes, officer," Beatrice replied quietly, accepting the ticket. She was remarkably poised, even as Peter regarded her with thinly veiled disdain. They resolved the situation swiftly, letting the pickup driver go on his way. Beatrice parked her sedan properly and took a deep breath, clearly regrouping before she started for the courthouse steps. As Peter turned away, Robert noticed something unusual. Beatrice had pulled out a small FBI identification badge from her purse and quickly slipped it back in. Robert couldn't read the details from his angle, but the glint of the official FBI seal was unmistakable. His brow furrowed, a curious unease tightening in his chest. "Peter, hold on," Robert murmured. "I think she might be." But his partner waved him off, swaggering back to the cruiser. "Come on, let's go. We've got better things to do." Robert cast one last puzzled glance at the woman, who was now ascending the courthouse steps, head held high. He had a strange feeling he just witnessed something bigger than a simple traffic ticket, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The Fulton County Courthouse lobby buzzed with all manner of people. Lawyers in crisp suits, weary defendants in rumpled clothes, anxious families, and stoic officers drifted through metal detectors. The air-conditioned interior provided relief from the muggy day, but the tension was palpable nonetheless. Beatrice Hathaway stepped inside. At once, she was greeted by a swarm of hushed whispers. A tall, slender man in a dark suit, whose FBI credentials dangled from a lanyard, approached her. He whispered something into her ear with a respectful dip of his head. She nodded, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Meanwhile, Peter and Robert filed in behind a group of uniformed officers. Usually, the courthouse was a place Peter disliked. There were too many lawyers, too many rules that reigned in his bravado. But his presence was requested for a minor testimony on a routine drug possession case he'd handled the week prior. He'd be in and out in no time, so he thought. Robert, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling about the woman they'd just encountered. She was nowhere to be seen in the throng, and he wondered if she had gone to another hearing. "Peter, something's not adding up," he said quietly. Peter scrolled through his phone with one hand, barely paying attention. "What are you yammering about, Robert? That woman, I'm almost certain she had an FBI badge. Why would an FBI official be driving herself alone to a county courthouse with no escort?" Peter stopped fiddling with his phone long enough to toss an incredulous glance at Robert. "She's old. Probably it was her grandson's keychain or something. I swear, sometimes you see conspiracies in everything." Robert frowned, but let the topic drop for the moment. They passed through the metal detectors and made their way to courtroom 2B, where they would provide testimony. The hallway leading to it was lined with benches occupied by defendants, witnesses, and family members waiting for their cases to be called. The fluorescent lights overhead lent a harsh brightness, emphasizing the anxiety etched on every face. "Hey, Harris," a voice called from behind. It was District Attorney Madeline Cooper, a stern but fair-minded prosecutor known around town for her meticulous approach. She carried a stack of files pressed against a neat charcoal suit. Peter offered a casual nod. "Morning, Miss Cooper." She handed him a sheet of paper. "We're up third on the docket," she explained. "The judge is wrapping up a burglary case first. Shouldn't be long." Peter scanned the near-empty room. Better than waiting around all day. Robert took a seat in the gallery next to a handful of other witnesses. Peter remained standing near the front, checking his reflection in the polished wooden rail that separated the gallery from the judge's bench. He straightened his tie, adjusted his uniform. It was almost second nature. He wanted to look impeccable in front of the judge, a show of confidence that he believed helped tip cases in his favor. A side door opened, and a bailiff stepped in, beckoning for the next defendant. A hush fell over the few people present. Moments later, the burglary case concluded swiftly, with the defendant accepting a plea deal. D.A. Cooper motioned for Peter to follow, and they both approached the front as the next case was called. Just then, another door to the courtroom opened, and in walked Beatrice Hathaway. She was accompanied by the same tall, suited man from the lobby, along with a couple of uniformed FBI agents. Their presence was quiet but resolute, like guardians escorting a revered figure. Peter blinked, not immediately registering the connection. Meanwhile, Robert's eyes widened. He lightly nudged Peter. "That's her from this morning." "Wait, what is she doing here?" Peter whispered harshly. Before Robert could reply, the judge cleared his throat, calling the courtroom to order. Peter and D.A. Cooper stepped forward as the minor drug possession case was announced. The defendant, a scrawny teenager with hollow cheeks, stood beside a public defender. Peter took his oath, describing how he had discovered narcotics in the teenager's car during a routine stop. It was straightforward testimony, but as Peter gave his account, his mind kept wandering. Beatrice, who had taken a seat in the audience, listened attentively. Though her case had not yet been called, she seemed calm, as if in no hurry. It unnerved Peter, her composure, her unflinching gaze that occasionally flicked to him as he testified. The judge concluded the matter, scheduling sentencing for a later date. "Officer Harris, you're free to go," the judge said. Peter nodded and stepped away, feeling a slight tremor in his stomach. He glanced briefly at Beatrice, who met his eyes with a neutral expression. Their gazes locked for a half-second that felt much longer. Then she looked away, whispering something to the agent seated beside her. "What is going on?" Peter murmured under his breath as he rejoined Robert. Robert shrugged, though his mind was already racing with possibilities. Normally, Peter would have left right after giving his testimony, but curiosity, and perhaps a touch of unease, kept him rooted. He and Robert found seats in the back of the courtroom, far from Beatrice but still within sight. They watched as a different matter was called, a civil dispute over property lines that ended quickly, overshadowed by a hush that suddenly rippled through the courtroom as the clerk announced a new, somewhat mysterious case. "All rise for the matter of State of Georgia versus John Kincaid," the clerk intoned. There was a slight movement near the front. The name Kincaid was whispered among the few onlookers. Peter and Robert exchanged puzzled looks. They hadn't heard of this case before. The judge, a middle-aged man with an authoritative presence, nodded to the clerk. "Will counsel approach?" the judge asked. From nowhere, two men in suits stepped forward. One was introduced as the defense attorney representing John Kincaid, while the other, an assistant DA named Bradley Finch, represented the state. A hush fell over the courtroom again as the side door opened and a tall, silver-haired man with a steely gaze was let in, wearing an impeccable suit. This had to be John Kincaid. Right behind him, calmly taking a seat in the front row, was Beatrice Hathaway. Her presence alone demanded attention, though still nobody had publicly identified who she was. The tension in the air was almost tangible. "Your Honor," began the assistant DA, "we have reason to believe Mr. Kincaid has been involved in high-level financial crimes, including money laundering that crosses state lines and possibly ties to larger organized crime activities. We respectfully request that this matter be transferred to federal jurisdiction for further investigation." A murmur spread throughout the room. Federal jurisdiction? That might explain the FBI presence. Kincaid's defense attorney objected, launching into a series of arguments about insufficient evidence. But before he could finish, the tall FBI agent who had accompanied Beatrice rose, cleared his throat, and addressed the court. "Pardon the interruption, Your Honor," he said respectfully. "My name is Special Agent Stephen Mills, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have probable cause and significant evidence. We request a detention hearing given Mr. Kincaid's flight risk and the seriousness of the charges." The judge eyed the FBI agent. "And who do you represent exactly, Agent Mills?" Agent Mills nodded respectfully. "I work under the direction of the Criminal Investigative Division, specifically the Financial Crime Section at the FBI's J. Edgar Hoover Building. We have direct oversight from our leadership regarding Mr. Kincaid's case." At that moment, Beatrice stood. Though she did not identify herself verbally, she offered the judge a crisp, respectful nod. A wave of whispers coursed through the courtroom. Her posture was that of someone used to leading entire rooms full of agents, not just quietly observing. Peter's heart pounded as he watched this unfold. "Robert," he whispered, "this is big. She's definitely FBI, but she looks so unassuming. Clearly not someone to mess with," Robert replied. Before either of them could speculate further, the judge turned his gaze toward Beatrice. "Ma'am, you have something to add?" he asked, slightly unsure of the proper protocol for someone of her apparent rank. Beatrice cleared her throat gently. "Your Honor, I'm Director Beatrice L. Hathaway from the FBI's National Security Branch. I'm here to observe and, if necessary, offer testimony regarding the urgency of placing John Kincaid in federal custody." You could have heard a pin drop. The phrase "director" hung in the air. A wave of stunned expressions swept the gallery. Several lawyers craned their necks to get a glimpse of this unassuming older woman who was, in fact, a high-ranking FBI director, someone who rarely set foot in a local courtroom unless something of national importance was at stake. Robert let out a low whistle, his suspicions confirmed. Peter, on the other hand, swallowed hard, recalling just minutes earlier how he'd belittled her, called her grandma, in a snide tone. The judge blinked in surprise, then quickly regained composure. "Director Hathaway, we appreciate your presence. Please be seated." The court acknowledges the FBI's motion to transfer jurisdiction. Let's hear the basis. During the next 45 minutes, Agent Mills outlined how Kincaid was allegedly funneling millions in illicit funds tied to an international ring. Beatrice spoke only twice, offering precise and unassailable clarifications about the severity of Kincaid's international connections. Each time she spoke, the authority in her voice was unmistakable. The judge, sufficiently convinced, ruled that the matter did indeed cross federal boundaries and should be transferred accordingly. He also approved the request for Kincaid's detention, citing overwhelming evidence of flight risk. A smattering of applause broke out from onlookers who'd come to see justice done. Peter felt an inexplicable knot in his stomach. This unassuming older woman he had mocked earlier was no ordinary citizen. She was at the pinnacle of federal law enforcement, and she was here in the same courtroom, likely aware of who he was because, after all, she had sat through his entire testimony in the previous case. As the courtroom began to clear, Beatrice and her entourage stood to exit. Peter found himself frozen to his seat, uncertain whether he should approach or slip out discreetly. Robert, for once, noticed his partner's hesitation and took the lead. They moved closer to the aisle just as Beatrice and her agents reached it. For a moment, Peter thought he might avoid direct contact, but Beatrice paused, her dark, perceptive eyes locking onto Peter. She raised a single eyebrow. "Officer Harris, isn't it?" she asked in a measured tone. A flush of red crept up Peter's neck. "Yes, ma'am," he managed, swallowing. She studied him for a moment, neither smiling nor frowning. "I see you made it to court in time for your testimony," she observed coolly. "I trust you've concluded your case successfully." Peter nodded stiffly. "Yes, Director, it went fine." Silence hung heavy in the air, the rest of the crowd giving them a wide berth. Robert took a subtle step back, instinctively sensing this was a conversation Peter had to handle himself. Beatrice glanced briefly at Robert, then her attention returned to Peter. "It's unfortunate we first met under tense circumstances this morning," she said softly, referencing the traffic stop. "I believe you were the officer who wrote me that citation." Peter opened his mouth, searching for words apologies, justifications, or some combination thereof, but nothing came out. He realized how foolish, how arrogant he must have seemed. She let him squirm for a moment before continuing. I have no issue with you doing your job, Officer Harris. If I ran a red light, I should be cited. But I'd advise you to reflect on how you speak to people you don't know. A little respect goes a long way, even in law enforcement. Her words were firm, yet not unkind, carrying an undeniable moral weight. Peter felt smaller than he ever had in his entire career. All he could manage was a nod. Yes, Director, understood. Beatrice glanced down at the ticket in her hand, then met his eyes one last time. Have a safe day, Officer Harris. With that, she turned and walked away, the small entourage following in her wake. The entire exchange had lasted only seconds, but to Peter, it felt like an eternity. The next few days were a blur for Peter. Though he tried to push the encounter from his mind, it lingered like a haunting echo. He found himself replaying the moment he'd sneered at Beatrice by her car, calling her grandma. He also remembered the command in her voice inside the courtroom, how a hush fell as she mentioned her credentials. Robert noticed Peter's uncharacteristic quietness. In the locker room after shift one day, he approached gently. You okay, buddy? Peter sighed, slumping onto a bench. I can't stop thinking about it. What if she decides to lodge a complaint? What if the department hears about how I treated a high-ranking FBI director? That's a career killer. Robert offered a sympathetic shrug. She doesn't strike me as vengeful. If she wanted to file a complaint, she would have done it already. Maybe she just wants you to learn a lesson. Peter rubbed his temples. It's not just about a complaint, Robert. I feel like an idiot. Everyone's always told me I can be too arrogant. And now, of all people, I disrespect an FBI director, someone who spent her life upholding the same law I claim to serve. Robert settled beside him. Then maybe it's time to change, Peter. Peter scoffed, though without the usual hostility. Easier said than done. But you're right. Just when Peter thought the whole ordeal might fade into a shameful memory, fate played a cruel trick. A memo circulated through the department, indicating that a joint operation with the FBI was in the works, something to do with the John Kincaid investigation and other financial crimes that had tentacles reaching into local communities. The memo asked for volunteer officers to assist in a multi-jurisdictional task force. Robert read it and immediately looked at Peter. We'd be crazy not to join. This is big-time career stuff. Plus, we can do real good. Peter swallowed. The thought of working with the FBI and possibly crossing paths with Director Hathaway again was daunting, but a small part of him saw it as an opportunity for redemption. Maybe. Yeah, he agreed softly. Let's do it. The following week, they arrived at a drab conference room in the downtown FBI field office. They'd been called in for a briefing. Around a large rectangular table sat a mix of federal agents, local police officers from various precincts, and a few stern-faced prosecutors. A slide projector displayed images of what seemed to be spreadsheets and money transfer receipts. Special Agent Mills stood at the front once again. Peter felt a wave of discomfort as he recognized the man from the courthouse. Sure enough, Mills spotted him and gave a tight nod, offering no immediate comment. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mills began. Thank you for joining the multi-agency task force targeting the Kincaid network. We have reason to believe that local corruption is enabling this money laundering to continue unchecked. Director Hathaway has personally authorized this team to root out wrongdoing at every level, no matter who is involved. The mention of Beatrice Hathaway's name made Peter's heart skip a beat. He noticed a few subtle glances in his direction, including from Robert, but he kept his expression neutral. Mills continued, outlining the investigative methods they'd employ: financial audits, undercover work, surveillance operations. Each member of the task force would have a specific role, from data analysis to field assignments. Toward the end of the briefing, Mills cleared his throat. Before we wrap up, Director Hathaway wants to extend her gratitude to all who volunteered. She also specifically requested that Officer Harris, he paused, flipping a page in his notes, and Officer Green from Atlanta PD be assigned to field surveillance, given their familiarity with local hotspots. Peter stiffened. That was it. He was in for it now. Why would Director Hathaway specifically name him unless she wanted to keep an eye on him? Across the table, Robert raised an eyebrow but managed a small nod. If Beatrice had wanted to punish Peter, she could have easily barred him from the task force or filed a formal complaint. Instead, it seemed she was placing trust, or at least responsibility, on his shoulders. The next few weeks found Peter and Robert working long shifts, tailing possible suspects linked to Kincaid's laundering scheme. They staked out shady bars, monitored wire transfers, and even shadowed a few local officials rumored to have ties to the operation. During a particularly grueling overnight watch, Peter sat in an unmarked SUV with Robert. The stale smell of coffee and fast food wrappers filled the air. Peter was restless, scanning the dimly lit parking lot of a warehouse where suspicious trucks came and went at odd hours. Robert broke the silence. "Remember the old days, Peter, when we used to talk about making detective, working big cases?" Peter nodded. "Yeah, I wanted to get out of uniform patrol. Seemed like it'd be more exciting. Still does, in a way. But never thought we'd jump right into an FBI-led operation, that's for sure." Peter exhaled, tapping the steering wheel lightly. "Think Director Hathaway is testing me?" Robert shrugged. "Possibly. Or maybe she just sees potential in you, if you can get past your own pride." Peter didn't reply. Instead, he focused on a black SUV that pulled into the warehouse lot, headlights off. Two men got out, carrying duffel bags. Peter raised a camera with a telephoto lens, snapping pictures. "It's them," Peter murmured, suspects from the briefing. For the next hour, they documented the men's actions. Large crates being loaded into the SUV, furtive glances around the property. Finally, the men drove off, and Peter and Robert followed at a safe distance. They relayed the vehicle's direction to Central Command, where Agent Mills coordinated additional surveillance. The adrenaline rush momentarily pushed aside Peter's worries. He was good at this, observant, methodical, if only he could lose the arrogance that so often marred his interactions with civilians. Later that week, word came down that Director Hathaway wanted an in-person update from the local teams. Peter braced himself, certain that meant he'd be face-to-face with her once more. Sure enough, they were summoned to the FBI's regional headquarters, a tall glass building reflecting the Atlanta skyline. Peter, Robert, and a few others arrived in the large conference room on the 10th floor. Beatrice Hathaway stood at the head of the table, conversing quietly with Agent Mills and another agent. Her presence radiated an understated confidence. She wore a tailored navy suit, a small American flag pin on the lapel. When she spotted Peter, she acknowledged him with a courteous nod, no more, no less. He took a seat, heart pounding. "Thank you all for coming," Beatrice began, her voice resonating clearly. "The Kincaid investigation is moving along, but we have new intelligence that suggests local law enforcement corruption may be deeper than we initially suspected. Several high-level city officials might be complicit, or at the very least turning a blind eye to Kincaid's operations." The room listened intently as she and Agent Mills laid out evidence of suspicious property transactions, bank deposits, and phone records linking Kincaid's associates to certain local government offices. When Beatrice concluded, she looked around the table, her gaze eventually resting on Peter. "Officer Harris, Officer Green, I've read your surveillance reports. Excellent work on that warehouse stakeout. The photographs you took were crucial in identifying one of Kincaid's lieutenants." Peter's cheeks warmed at the unexpected praise. "Thank you, Director. We'll keep at it." A faint smile touched Beatrice's lips, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "Indeed. Now, as we move forward, we'll need cooperation from the Atlanta PD to ensure we're not compromised from within. Your leadership has suggested the two of you might be best suited for deeper undercover involvement, given your familiarity with potential suspects." Robert's eyes widened. "Undercover?" Beatrice nodded. "We have reason to believe a few high-ranking individuals in the city's licensing department are expediting permits for Kincaid's shell companies. We'd like you to pose as crooked cops, willing to expedite certain favors. This would give us first-hand evidence of bribery attempts." Peter felt a thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. Undercover work was the kind of assignment that could make or break a career. "We're ready," he said, with an unusual sense of humility. Beatrice studied him for a moment. "I believe you are," she said softly. Then she addressed the room. "Everyone else, continue your assigned tasks. Let's keep the circle small on the undercover operation. Trust is paramount here." Meeting adjourned. The team filed out. Beatrice lingered, speaking quietly with Peter and Robert. She asked more in-depth questions about their approach, emphasizing the importance of caution. Finally, as their conversation wrapped up, Beatrice fixed Peter with a direct gaze. "Officer Harris, I know we had an uncomfortable start, but I want you to understand something. No one is above the law, including me. We all must earn our respect each day, especially in this line of work. Peter nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. Yes, Director. I appreciate the opportunity. For a fleeting moment, Beatrice's stern demeanor softened. Good luck. I'll be monitoring closely. The next phase of the operation was intense. Peter and Robert had to adopt a slightly different persona within their own department. They spread rumors, subtly, carefully, that they were frustrated with low pay, departmental politics, and might be willing to make some side money if the right offer came along. It felt risky, almost traitorous, but soon, their seeded rumors caught the attention of a mid-level bureaucrat rumored to be linked to the Kincaid operation. He reached out discreetly, arranging a meeting at a quiet bar on the outskirts of town. Peter and Robert, wired with hidden microphones, arrived one muggy evening. The bar smelled of stale beer and desperation, barely a handful of patrons scattered among the dimly lit tables. The contact, a twitchy man named George Willoughby, sat in a corner booth. After some initial wariness, George began to lay out a proposition. If Peter and Robert could overlook certain suspicious warehouse activities or ensure that evidence went missing, George would ensure they were compensated. He slipped an envelope across the table, stuffed with bills. Peter's throat tightened. Even though he knew this was part of the sting, the act of physically taking that envelope felt like crossing a line. He did it anyway, reminding himself it was for the greater good. All the while, the hidden recording device relayed everything to an FBI van parked discreetly down the block. Agents listened and documented every word. George smirked. Let's just say, Mr. Kincaid appreciates officers who are understanding. Keep that envelope, and there's more where that came from. Peter forced himself to smile crookedly. Well, we can look the other way if the price is right. Robert, too, feigned interest. If we do this, we want to meet the man himself, eventually. We're not taking all the risk for peanuts. George hesitated. Meeting Kincaid directly is a big ask. Let's see how you handle one or two tasks first. Over the next few weeks, Peter and Robert reported each detail of their infiltration to the FBI. They tampered with evidence in a controlled manner, always ensuring the FBI had backups. They needed to appear legitimate in their corruption so that George and his handlers would trust them more deeply. Though the operation progressed smoothly, the moral weight was enormous. Peter often found himself lying awake at night, replaying the day's events. He used to sneer at the idea of working with caution or empathy, but now the stakes were so high that every move felt precarious. One sweltering afternoon, Peter was summoned to the FBI field office for a briefing. To his surprise, when he arrived, Beatrice Hathaway herself was waiting in a smaller, private conference room along with Agent Mills. Officer Harris, she greeted evenly. How goes the infiltration? He placed a small device on the table, his daily logs, audio recordings, everything the FBI needed to continue building their case. We're in deeper now. George Willoughby introduced us to a local real estate mogul who's also part of Kincaid's ring. They're funneling money through property flips. Agent Mills nodded approvingly. That's consistent with what we have. Beatrice studied Peter. How are you holding up? He paused, unprepared for the personal concern in her question. Honestly, it's tough. I know it's part of the job, but it feels wrong to pretend to be crooked. Beatrice offered a small nod of empathy. If it didn't feel wrong, you wouldn't be a good officer. The fact that it weighs on you shows you understand the responsibility that comes with the badge. Peter lowered his gaze. Director, I never apologized properly for how I treated you the first day we met. I'm not proud of it. I'm sorry. She regarded him for a moment, then nodded slowly. Apology accepted. Let's focus on finishing this case, shall we? Relief washed over Peter, though he felt a swirl of emotions. In that moment, he understood Beatrice's approach to leadership. She was firm, but fair, always leaving room for growth and redemption. With each passing day, the task force drew closer to busting wide open the entire Kincaid network. Documents pointed to corrupt officials inside the city's licensing and zoning offices, as well as some connections to local business owners who laundered money. Peter and Robert's final test came when George invited them to a discreet gathering at a luxurious penthouse belonging to one of Kincaid's associates. Supposedly, Kincaid himself might make an appearance, or, at the very least, key figures in the operation. The plan: gather enough evidence, then signal the FBI to raid the premises. It was dangerous. Peter and Robert would be alone in a room full of criminals, any of whom might catch on to the sting. The night of the meeting arrived. They dressed in casual but expensive-looking clothes, courtesy of the FBI's budget for undercover operations. Under the tailored jackets, each wore a Kevlar vest, and they carried concealed sidearms, just in case. At the penthouse, ornate marble floors, modern art, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sparkling Atlanta skyline greeted them. The guests were a mix of business people, city officials, and shady characters who spoke in hushed tones about investments and arrangements. Peter and Robert kept their cool, sipping club soda masquerading as cocktails. George approached, beckoning them to a secluded corner. "Gentlemen, let me introduce you to Mr. Kincaid." A tall, silver-haired man approached. Yes, the same figure from the courtroom that day. His piercing eyes sized them up with a predator's cunning. "So, you're the new recruits, huh?" Kincaid said, voice low and confident. Peter forced a smile. "Officer Harris, and this is Officer Green. We're ready to do business." Kincaid smirked. "We'll see. For now, enjoy the party." They chatted for a while, gleaning bits of incriminating information. Then, as the night went on, Kincaid led them to a private study. In this more intimate space, far from prying ears, he laid out the next step of their collaboration: sabotage an official city records database so that certain property taxes disappeared, saving Kincaid's shell companies millions. Peter pretended to consider the proposition. "That's risky. We'll want double our usual fee." Kincaid's grin never wavered. "As long as you can guarantee no trail leads back to me, money's no object." The conversation was being recorded by a device in Peter's watch. They had him conspiracy to commit fraud, potentially dozens of federal charges. The only step remaining was the raid. But in that moment, Peter noticed Kincaid's eyes flick to a corner of the room, where a security camera monitored them. Kincaid's smile faltered. "Wait," he said abruptly, stepping back. A wave of cold dread washed over Peter. "What's wrong?" Kincaid's hand hovered near a hidden switch under his desk. "I always trust my gut," he said quietly. "Empty your pockets." Robert tensed. "We came unarmed. What's the problem?" Kincaid's eyes narrowed. "Empty them now." Peter felt sweat trickle down his spine. If Kincaid found the wire or the watch, everything could go sideways, fast. He discreetly reached into his pocket, gripping the small panic button that would send a prearranged signal to the FBI agents waiting nearby. George entered the study, confusion etched on his face. "What's the matter, boss?" Kincaid sneered at him. "I think you brought me cops who are a little too clean." Before Peter or Robert could react, the door burst open. Uniformed FBI agents poured in, guns drawn. Beatrice Hathaway herself was at the forefront, wearing body armor, her expression steeled. "FBI, everyone stand down," she commanded. Chaos erupted. Kincaid slammed his hand on the switch under the desk, and alarms blared throughout the penthouse. A flurry of movement followed. Guards rushed to block the door, while some tried to flee. In the melee, Peter ducked behind a couch, returning fire at two armed men. Robert tackled a guard who lunged at Beatrice. The FBI swarmed, with well-practiced precision, quickly overpowering the criminals. Glass shattered, an opulent vase knocked over in the chaos. Kincaid attempted to retreat to a private elevator, but Agent Mills and two other agents intercepted him, forcing him to the ground. When the dust settled, Kincaid, George, and a dozen associates were handcuffed. The entire penthouse was in disarray, furniture overturned, broken glass scattered. Outside, the city skyline glittered peacefully, as if oblivious to the takedown happening within. Following the raid, news headlines splashed across local channels. FBI and Atlanta PD bust major money laundering ring, high-level officials arrested in sweeping operation, and so forth. The public was stunned by how close organized crime had come to infiltrating the heart of the city's governance. One of the most talked-about aspects of the operation was the undercover role played by officers Harris and Green, praised for their bravery in exposing corruption. Peter found himself lauded in the press conference that Beatrice Hathaway held, though she kept his identity partly shielded due to potential retaliation. Standing before the cameras, Beatrice gave a measured statement. "Today's arrests show that cooperation between federal and local law enforcement is crucial in combating corruption. I commend the Atlanta Police Department for their invaluable assistance." Behind her, Agent Mills, Peter, and Robert observed the throng of reporters. Peter spotted the glint of the cameras, the curious eyes of journalists hungry for more details. A strange sense of humility and gratitude filled him. After the press conference, Beatrice pulled Peter aside. "You did well, Officer Harris. I know this wasn't easy." Peter looked down, thinking of how far he'd come from that cynical cop who sneered at her the first day. "Thank you, Director, for giving me a chance to prove myself." She offered a hint of a smile. "Just remember, respect is earned through actions, not words. Keep doing the right thing." Peter nodded, a sense of resolve forming in his chest. Weeks later, life had returned to a semblance of normal. Peter no longer swaggered through the station with arrogance. The old jokes and crude remarks that once peppered his daily routine had vanished. Robert even noticed how Peter approached each call with more empathy. The Departmental Review Board recognized Peter's vital role in the sting operation. He received a commendation, along with Robert, though the details of their undercover work remained partially sealed for security reasons. Peter also faced an internal reflection about his earlier misconduct. He voluntarily attended counseling sessions to address the underlying biases and anger that had fueled his previous behavior. Meanwhile, Beatrice Hathaway's presence in Atlanta wound down. The FBI had its indictments, the criminals were facing trial, and her direct oversight was no longer needed. She prepared to return to Washington, D.C., where her responsibilities in the National Security Branch awaited. Before leaving, she asked to see Peter one last time. They met in a small office adjacent to the squad room. She regarded him kindly. "I'll be going back to the Hoover Building soon, Officer Harris," she said. "I wanted to say goodbye in person." He nodded. "I appreciate everything you've done, Director." She reached into her purse and pulled out the old ticket he'd written for her that first day, the citation for running a red light. "I believe I owe the city a fine," she said, a touch of humor in her voice. "I never did pay this." Peter couldn't help but grin. "I think we can dismiss that, Director, under the circumstances." She handed him a check anyway, made out to the Fulton County clerk. "No one is above the law, remember?" He accepted it, recalling her words from before. "Yes, ma'am." Beatrice extended her hand. "Take care of yourself, Officer Harris." They shook hands, no animosity, only mutual respect. In that moment, Peter realized the profound transformation he'd undergone. He had mocked this woman before he knew who she was, and he'd paid for his arrogance through a trial by fire. But he'd emerged a better lawman, and perhaps a better person. As Beatrice left, Peter stared at the citation in his hand. It was a tangible reminder of how easily prejudice and disrespect could cloud one's judgment. With a final nod to himself, he headed to the clerk's office to finalize the payment, determined to close that chapter the right way. In the end, the story of Officer Peter Harris and FBI Director Beatrice Hathaway proves that no one should ever be judged by appearances, and that true respect is something we earn day by day, choice by choice. Peter's transformation from an arrogant, mocking cop to a dedicated lawman who risked everything for justice stands as a testament to the human capacity for growth and change. Meanwhile, Beatrice's unyielding resolve reminds us that real power isn't about shouting the loudest or flaunting authority. It's about leading with calm conviction, offering second chances, and doing what's right, even when no one is watching.